welcome back, Business 163, Personal Finance. And in video number 2 now, we are looking at the topic of renter's insurance. Indeed, where many of us start out in life after we move out from our parents' house, we rent an apartment or a house with a bunch of friends, or many times we will rent before we buy. And some folks will rent for the balance of their lives without ever buying a house. And so one of the things you have to consider is, what about all the stuff you've got? And is it worth purchasing insurance to protect that? Well, let's ask some questions. What would you do if, well, you woke up one night to water pouring through the ceiling in your living room, all over your couch, your furniture, your tables, right? Or what if a guest visited your apartment and maybe slipped on some liquid in the kitchen floor and broke their leg? Or what would you do if you lived on the 3rd or 4th floor of an apartment complex and accidentally dropped a bag of groceries over the balcony and it broke a car window down below? What if you got home from the grocery store and you found your apartment had been robbed, especially knowing that, as you see the last bullet point, the average value of items most frequently taken during a burglary in the United States, average value $2,799. Ouch, that's actually a pretty big sum of money, right? What would you do if this happened and you were renting? Well, this is the reason why we have renter's insurance. Renter's insurance in the United States typically offers 3 primary types of coverages: personal property coverage, personal liability coverage, and loss of use coverage. Let's talk about that. What's personal property coverage? As the name sort of implies, it's coverage that covers your belongings in the case of damage, destruction, some weather problems, or theft. And you should be aware there are 2 types of coverage that you can choose from. There is replacement cost value and there is actual cost value. And you see the differences here on the slide. Replacement cost value means that if you suffer a loss, that coverage would pay you out as if your belongings were brand new to replace them. Whereas actual cost value pays you out the depreciated value of your belongings, the current value, rather than just whatever the value is to replace. And as you might guess, actual cost value many times will have a substantially lower cost, but just realize if you suffer a loss, well, you may not get everything replaced brand new because they don't pay you that much, right? So some things to consider there. That's the first type of coverage often included in renter's insurance. The second type of coverage is personal liability coverage, which covers and pays if someone is hurt in your residence or if you damage someone else's property. And so that's an actual example, by the way. Similar to the dropping the groceries over the balcony, we heard of a case once where somebody was smoking a cigarette out on his balcony, and what happened was the embers from his cigarette drifted down below, caused a fire, and damaged someone else's property, right? And of course they filed a lawsuit, and thankfully his renter's insurance included personal liability coverage, and so that kicked in. Otherwise it would have been, well, an extremely expensive mistake. Finally, there is loss of use coverage. Covers the cost of temporary shelter and other expenses if you need to move out due to issue with your rental. And I actually know of a case where this happened. A couple I knew were renting an apartment in Livermore, and water came in. It was a busted refrigerator ice maker water line that was strung through the ceiling. It was leaking, came through the ceiling, and basically destroyed the roof of their apartment, and their renter's insurance put them up in a hotel for the entire time that it took them to get that all straightened out. That's what loss of use coverage is there for. Now, you should know, I'm renting, should I get renter's insurance? Well, realize that the average cost of renter's insurance in California is $207 a year. That's less than $18 a month. For most of us, that's extremely affordable. And for what it covers, that may be one of the best deals in insurance around, is securing renter's insurance. There's really very little reason not to get renter's insurance with these kinds of costs. And yet, interestingly, only 35% of renters in the state of California have a current renter's insurance policy. Many renters don't get renter's insurance for whatever reason. Maybe because they mistakenly believe that somehow, that their landlord's insurance would cover them, or they're not aware that renter's insurance is available, or they mistakenly don't get a quote, and so they just presume it's going to be too expensive. But you can see here, the average cost is probably right within most folks' price range, and so something we really ought to consider. And then, of course, there is another question, which is, do I need renter's insurance when I go to college? And so for many college students, when they finally move out of home, go perhaps to a four-year university, in-state or out-of-state, start living in on-campus housing. Well, here's the way this breaks down. If you live in campus housing, like a dormitory, typically your belongings will be covered by your parents' homeowner's policy. Now, of course, you want to have your parents call their insurance agent just to double check that. But most insurance policies, most homeowners' policies do have this clause in there that for children, when they go to college, some percentage of property coverage applies to the stuff that's in your dorm. However, if you choose to live in off-campus housing, like you and some buddies end up renting an apartment your sophomore year or something like that, well, you really should consider getting some renter's insurance, as most parents' homeowners policies will not cover your belongings in off-campus housing like an apartment. All right? So those are all sort of the ways that the typical questions about renter's insurance breaks down. And really, the big question is, why wouldn't you accommodate that into your budget based upon where you choose to rent? With the costs being what they are, it really is common sense to make sure that your personal property is covered, that you buy insurance to cover yourself against personal liability to damage of someone else, right? Just makes good sense, something to consider. Now, again, I'm not an insurance salesman. I make no money from this, but I do want to tell you it does make common sense for most of us to consider renter's insurance when we are renting. Alrighty, hope that's helpful. We'll see you in the next lecture.